So here's where we last left off in lesson 4, where we positioned the Jeep model within our scene. Now in this lesson we'll talk about the difficulties in texturing an imported 3D model and how to work around and solve some of those problems. To begin with, this model did come with a whole handful of textures that were already assigned to it, and they come in as targa files, that's TGAs. Now while Photoshop can read a targa file without any problem, it doesn't seem to like mapping targa textures onto the 3D models. So let's take all of these and open them up and change them all to JPEGs. So we'll go through each one individually and simply say File, Save As, and save it as a JPEG. Now you may be wondering what some of these look like. Clearly this is the side of the Jeep's tire, but some of the other ones aren't quite as obvious. For example, this textura.targa, what they're doing here is they've included several different textures into one texture file. And then that's mapped onto several different meshes within the 3D model, but then it's simply moved around so it only uses the part that each individual mesh needs. But for now, you don't really need to worry about that because all that information is stored within the model itself. Right now, all you really need to do is transfer all of these into JPEGs. So the next thing we need to do is to begin adjusting the texture mapping that's already on this model. Because right now, it looks like it's sort of carved out of a white clay. It doesn't look at all realistic. And the physical attributes of the shaders on this model don't quite look right either. So what we'll do is open up in the 3D panel all of these sub-mesh layers here, because they're all grouped together within this one layer that's called plate rear for some reason. But if you look through each one of these, each little mesh layer has its own shader assigned to it. Now, because this is imported, a lot of times the shader assignments, they work, but the different physical properties of them don't really translate quite so well. In this case, it comes in very bright and very shiny, which really isn't what we want. And that's a common theme throughout all of the materials that are applied to this model. So what I'm going to do is select all of them. With that top one selected, scroll down, hold down the Shift key, and select all of them, and make some global changes here. First of all, I'll click on the diffuse color chip here, and make sure the RGB settings are at 204. That's a mid-level gray. Now for the specular, I'll make sure the RGB settings are at 51, which is considerably darker than it was originally. Now the illumination should already be totally black. We'll do the same thing for the ambient color as well. And then we'll take the shine value and turn that down to about 20%. And then the next thing that we need to do is go through and start realigning the texture definitions. Now as we select each individual mesh here, you can see the material that's assigned to it. And along the diffuse line here, we have this different little icon. This means that there's already a texture assigned to it. But that texture isn't lining up because it's still pointing to those original targa files. So what we need to do is remap it to the JPEG files. If you're unsure what file it needs to go to, simply hovering over it will give you a little preview. If that's not helpful, you can go to the Edit UV Properties line and it actually tells you the name of the texture that it's looking for. In this case, it's looking for default texture 1.psd. Now, we don't have a file that corresponds to that. So what we'll do in this case is remove the texture. And for any of them that have the texture set like that, that's exactly what we'll do. We will replace it for the ones that line up and then remove it for the ones that have a default setting. In this case, it's the textura file. Now, I'm not going to take the time and show you each and every one of these, but I am going through and remapping each of these one by one. Okay, there's a couple changes to the texturing that I wanted to draw your attention to here. First of all, with this line item here, this matte FF1D, 1D, 1D, this is essentially that bumper area. It's hard to really tell, but once you take off the texture that's already there, you can see that it changes to a dark black color. Now, I wanted the bumper to be a nice shiny chrome. So the way I accomplished that was to use the material picker here to select one of the metals here. I started with the metal silver brush, and then I increased the reflection to 80%, the shine to 40%, and I added an environment mapping. And that's by clicking on the folder icon and saying load texture. And for the environment map, I used the base setting JPEG that serves as the background for our 3D scene. In this way, that reflective chrome surface will be reflecting an image that looks just like that background. This is a small touch that really helps to sell the illusion that this model is actually in this scene. Another interesting change is this Boss 1 trans item here. This is the shell that goes over the back of the Jeep. And all I did here is take away that texture through that remove texture item there and added a deep yellow color to it. Also, this matte 802 F2 F2F is actually the glass. And for that one, I made sure the opacity was nice and light, so about 50%. The shine is up high, the reflection's up high, and I also added that same environment texture to the glass as well. Now, the only other texture that's really worth noting is the remap one here. You may have noticed that when you went to remap this, that there were two options to choose from. One was a flames and skull type of texture, and the other one was just a bland, almost white texture that has some grunge on the bottom of it. It looks like mud splash. Now, I've chosen that one, but what I'd like to do is change the main color of that so that the Jeep is nice and blue. I will pull up that texture that we were working with, go back to our regular layers panel, and unlock this background. And then I'm going to add a new layer underneath that original one and fill it with a blue color. And then change that original layer to a multiply mode. So this allows that blue to shine through while still keeping the grunge marks that were already built into the texture. Now, I think it's a little too uniform colored, so I'm going to add yet another new layer and run a cloud filter on that. So filter, render clouds, change this blending mode to overlay, and then decrease the opacity significantly. And then I will save this out as yet another JPEG file. And I'll call this one blue. So then when we come back into our Jeep setting here, we can map that new texture to the body. Replace texture, and here we go with the remap blue. So now before we do a quick render, let's look at our lighting again. Right now the only lighting we have is the infinite light and the environment. So the environment we will deal with a little bit more in the next lesson. Right now let's take a look at this infinite light. We can readjust the angle of it if we feel like we didn't quite get it right when we were just sketching it out in the last lesson. And I fully encourage an attempt to try to match up the color and the intensity of the lighting in the scene already. Now we know that this is sunlight, so it's not truly white. It's got a yellowish tint to it. So you want it to still be nice and white, but we want it to be yellow. And it needs to be fairly bright too, so I've cranked the intensity on this up to 112%. And then let's take a look at how this renders out. So we'll add our marquee selection around it and wait for a render. And there we go. Now, it's not looking perfect yet. There's still a lot of work we need to do before this actually looks photorealistic, but it's coming along fairly nicely.